And welcome to this Scottish Fabians event on the future of the Scottish economy after coronavirus. My name's Martin McCluskey and I'm a member of the Scottish Fabians Committee. This evening's event is the latest in a series that we've been running during lockdown with policy experts and Labour politicians, and you can find out more about our work and hopefully join us at scottish.fabians.org.uk. Tonight we've got a brilliant panel who are going to be discussing the state of the Scottish economy and looking ahead to what it might look like when we move through the coronavirus crisis. Now, coronavirus has obviously presented an immediate risk to life and safety. What has become more and more clear as we've gone through it has been the economic impact, firstly, of lockdown itself, and now as we start to unlock. We already know, and I'm sure that our panelists will talk about this in a moment, we already know that the Scottish economy is going through one of its deepest contractions in generations, and the human toll is significant. So in April alone, 100,000 additional people in Scotland claimed universal credit, and 1 in 5 Scottish businesses are mothballed at the moment. So the key questions ahead of us are how we can emerge from this economic crisis, how we can prevent more people from falling into poverty, and how the recovery can build a greener and fairer economy for all. So to discuss that tonight, we're pleased to have a great panel with us. We've got Shadow Chancellor Annalisa Dodds, who'll be joining us towards the end, Kate Dearden, Head of Research Policy and External Relations at the Trade Union Community, and Mark Mitchell, who's a researcher at the Fraser Allander Institute, and he's about to complete a PhD in economics at Edinburgh University. Due to a mix-up by us, we aren't joined tonight by Jackie Baillie, though she may join us at the very end. This is how tonight is going to work. We'll hear from each of our speakers for about 5 to 10 minutes. First, Mark and Kate will give us a sense of what things look like in the economy as a whole and how it's impacting on workers, and then Annalisa will set out the Labour Party's thinking about what she thinks needs to happen from both a UK and a Scottish perspective to recover from this crisis. We'll then have a short discussion before opening it up to Q&A from everyone on the call. So if you've got any questions, please just either use the raise hand button that's at the bottom of the screen and we'll bring you in to ask your question, or if you'd rather just stay away from the microphone, just stick them in the Q&A box. So first I'll turn to Mark. Mark, what do things look like out there right now, and what has been the impact of the past few months of lockdown?
Thanks very much, Martin. So yeah, as Martin says, I will just sort of quickly run through the emerging evidence on those points. And I say emerging because, as I'm sure everyone's aware, we're very much in the midst of the crisis at the minute. And most of the evidence we're talking about in terms of the impact of the pandemic and the lockdown on the economy is coming from new surveys and sort of estimates of what might happen based on our knowledge of the structure of the economy and what's happened in past recessions. So you could go to the first slide, Martin, please. So back at the start of the pandemic and the lockdown, we at the Fraser of Allander done a small bit of modelling to think about what the government measures might mean for economic activity in Scotland. And at that point, we estimated about a quarter of normal economic activity or GDP was going to be displaced or mothballed, is a term that's come to be used so often in the past few months. Now, recent data suggests that that's not actually an overestimate. And if anything, the scale of the shutdown might actually be greater than that. So recent estimates from places like the ONS and recently the Office of the Chief Economic Advisor here in Scotland have suggested that, as Martin alluded to at the start, about 1 in 5 businesses are temporarily closed, and that could affect up to 750,000 jobs. Now, I've just put a small table at the bottom here that shows you how we roughly modelled the impact of the lockdown on some broad sectors in Scotland. And you can easily go through these sectors and think about how the impact might actually be worse than what we might have thought, back in sort of March, April time. Perhaps the strongest example might be construction here, given that construction has been completely shut down in Scotland, whereas many businesses were allowed to continue in England, and that has also been extended on for a longer period of time. And on the right, again, picking up from a point Martin made at the start, I just put a graphic just to show the scale of the impact on the labour market. So the graph just shows you the monthly change in the claimant count over the past decade or so, and you see this sort of the small spike around about 2008, 2009, and the claimant count being roughly an estimate of how many people are new people are claiming sort of unemployment benefits, and then you see the enormous spike there in sort of March, April 2020, giving you an idea of the amount of new people who are moving into having to claim unemployment benefits. If you could go to the next slide, Martin. So as I said, much of the evidence is coming from sort of, in a lot of ways, innovative new surveys. So the ONS are keeping timely trackers of economic activity and the social impacts of the coronavirus. And places like the Scottish Chambers of Commerce and the Scottish Government are also speeding up the frequency of their surveys to keep a track of economic activity. So two things we do know, two broad points from this sort of high frequency evidence is that there's large falls in business activity. So on the left here, I have a graph showing you sort of declines in activity across every sector in Scotland, recorded by the Scottish Government's monthly business turnover index. So roughly speaking, a number below 50 on that graph shows a decrease in turnover. So we see that all sectors, apart from food retail, which is partly due to the stockpiling of toilet paper, have had a decrease in turnover, and the accommodation and food services has had a drastic drop in economic activity. And on the right, we have a graph showing you from two surveys, one from the Scottish Chamber of Commerce and one from the ONS, estimates of how likely businesses are to be taking up the government support schemes. And we can see that huge proportions of businesses here, as surveyed, obviously these aren't extensive surveys of every business, this is samples of a few thousand. The ONS sample is around about 7,000, which is the black bars on the chart. We see very large proportions of businesses accessing government support. So we have an enormous fall in business activity on one hand. On the other side, we have an enormous uptake of government support, all of which suggests that businesses are really struggling. If you go to the next slide, Martin. So, in a lot of ways, the actual number of the hit on the economy isn't so important, and we know it's going to be huge, and we know it's going to be large. And we at the Fraser, and a lot of people now are starting to move towards thinking about understanding the root causes, the structural causes, and as Martin said at the start, what the economy is going to look like on the other side of this. So I've just pulled out here sort of three main themes that have to be understood to understand what the economy will look like on the other side of the crisis. And it's so unique because the recession is temporary and deliberate. It's a deliberate shutdown of the economy, which has led to an unprecedented demand shock. Demand has changed completely across sectors, across regions. Consumption patterns have changed enormously, and there isn't a lot of, as I said, precedent for analysing how that might impact on the economy on the other side of this. And we know, and this is somewhat most salient in Scotland in a lot of ways, that the impacts are not going to be evenly distributed. So, of course, households are going to fare differently. City centres versus rural areas, sectors are affected in many different ways. And I've just put a small chart on the right to give an idea of that. If you can see by looking on the far right, the vast majority of businesses and the accommodation and food services in rural areas in Scotland are small. And we know that a lot of these rural areas depend on tourism, both internationally and domestically, for their economies. And we know that small businesses are some of the most likely to be disadvantaged in the current crisis, and be at risk of not making it through the other side of it, and be low on cash reserves and low on savings to make it through the economic shutdown. And we know the accommodation and food services is one that's particularly harshly affected by the crisis, given that the measures have been very strict and are going to last for quite some time. If you could go to the next slide, Martin, please. Now these, I'll just quickly touch on some differences now, perhaps between Scotland and the rest of the UK, and then some ideas of what to expect on the other side of the pandemic. So the glass half empty points are that, the recent track record and recovery from recessions isn't great. If we learned anything from the financial crisis, 2008, 2009, and the decade that followed it, it was that growth in GDP and also wages was stagnant. We didn't recover well. We didn't recover anywhere near as well as we have in previous recessions. So the graph on the right just shows you sort of growth in real GDP per capita in the wake of 4 recessions over the past 5 decades or so. And you can see that from 2010 to 2019, our real GDP growth was by far, much lower than in the wake of any recession beforehand. Back to the 70s, wages are also still lower than they were in 2008 by about 3%. Even as employment's picked up in Scotland in the last few years, and we had unemployment rates at record levels, wage growth was still stagnant, and we've yet to get back to pre-crisis wage levels after wages growing consistently over 5 decades up until the recession. And there's the sectoral impacts. Scotland has a large oil and gas sector up north. As we know, a lot of places, from cities like Edinburgh to rural areas, depend heavily on tourism. And then we had a sort of more stringent measures imposed on the construction sector here in Scotland. So there's these sort of sectoral impacts that might mean that we're affected differently. And there's also differences in policy responses that make the situation slightly different in Scotland as compared to the rest of the UK. And then again, as Martin mentioned at the start, you sometimes feel a little bit difficult to look at a glass being half full in the middle of a global health crisis and an economic crisis. But there are plenty of opportunities here in the aftermath of this crisis, on the other side of it, to think about how we might want to change the prevailing economic model, the prevailing policy model, and from ways that has been inefficient in the past. Also, there are plenty of opportunities to think about, rebuilding, and I think this phrase that's been often used in the last few weeks has been, rebuilding better, and thinking about the green economy, thinking about the productivity challenges we've faced over the last decade or so, and then integrating well-being more into our idea of economic success and growth. Go to the next slide, Martin. So finally, there's been a lot of talk about what the shape of the recession will be: a V, a swoosh, a bathtub. How quickly will we get anywhere close to sort of pre-crisis economic levels of economic activity? And consensus sort of has become that it's going to be slow and it's going to be gradual. That's for a number of reasons. Only some businesses will be able to restart, and probably with significant restrictions in place, particularly in the sectors most affected. And some won't be able to start anytime soon, in the coming months, if not by the end of the year at scale. Once we do restart, there's going to be a lot of uncertainty over the sort of infrastructure and the economy, and then how businesses are going to structure themselves in the wake of the shock. And then also there's the fact that savings of households and businesses have been more or less decimated over the months of the lockdown. So it's going to take a long period of time for consumption and investment and to recover to anywhere close to what they were pre-pandemic. There's also an enormous role for government. The government became a sort of economy of last resort during this crisis. So their help and guidance and the roadmap that they put out for the workers and society and the economy is going to be crucial. So it's probably going to be that we'll see a lot of interaction between the economy and the government over the coming months, and that might result in things like having to really think hard about, bespoke support for businesses, really specific types of support for really specific types of businesses, and really specific types of advice for specific types of businesses to avoid any confusion, any unnecessary extra loss of activity, loss of jobs, and loss of businesses. And then broadly, we need to start thinking about, we have started thinking about what the new normal might look like and what that means for business and what it means for the economy. Social distancing will likely be in place for some time. Even if social distancing was for some reason magically lifted, you have to think about the individuals and how people are going to feel comfortable interacting in the economy moving forward. And then again, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, businesses are going to restructure themselves differently, most likely, after this crisis. One thing that was drawn out at the start of this crisis was the effect of having sort of long-reaching global supply chains, not having businesses interconnected, within the country, and being prepared and resilient in the face of a crisis like this, where economic activity across countries was completely shut down. And as I mentioned, the last thing from me is just the idea of building back better and thinking about how we can come out of the crisis and perhaps improve on any inefficiencies that we might have built up in our sort of economic framework and our policy framework in the past decades. So that's all from me. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. That was loads of food for thought for the discussion in there. And some really interesting reflections, and also just about the kind of stark choices that are going to have to be made by government over the next period of time. So moving on to Kate. Kate is our second panellist for tonight. As I mentioned a moment ago, she works at the trade union community. They are really at the forefront of some of the professions that are being particularly affected by coronavirus. So among other sectors, they represent workers in private prisons, youth offender institutes, manufacturing industries like steel and textiles, and also in logistics. So they are the union for the company Whistle, who I'm sure have been delivering a lot of your parcels during lockdown. So Kate, how is this crisis affecting workers' lives and really affecting the workplace?
Thanks, Martin, and thanks so much for organising tonight into the Scottish Fabians, and for everyone for joining. Really great to see so many of you. I hope you get a lot from this evening. So as Martin kindly introduced us, we're a community, we're a general trade union. A lot of our members have been at the forefront of this crisis, particularly prison officers who are key workers and have been working really hard since day one, since back in March, as well as sort of all our other workers. So to give you a quick summary, a lot of our membership has been a real mix. A lot of our members are furloughed, still working. Some have been made redundant and some are working from home. So that's required quite a diverse response from us as a trade union, and how we've acted and worked with employers and government and come up with solutions and working out how we get through this and what the other side might look like. So before I touch on that specific different sectors, I want to talk a bit about how the current crisis is playing out on the workforce and what we're calling for a community and what we'd like to see in the future, and sort of dive into those different areas that workers are experiencing and facing, and what that means for sort of our wider economy and jobs and livelihoods across the country. So, we've seen, as Mark pointed out, millions of workers benefiting from the job retention scheme, and millions benefiting from the self-employed income support scheme too. They continue to be complete lifelines for workers across the UK, and indeed for our members, of which many have benefited from them, and it's really supported their family and making sure that their incomes have been secured. And we commend the government for introducing those schemes and in working with trade unions in particular to achieve such great schemes in the UK. Recognising that there's a lot still to be done from our perspective, and that it's not absolutely perfect, but it's a really, really good step, and we welcomed it from the government. And it's why we're particularly delighted that the schemes have been extended when considering the uncertainty the virus brings and its impact on our economy, as Mark's also really helpfully outlined for us. And that demonstrated the need to extend that job retention scheme to October, and the self-employed income support scheme for a further 3 months, which both of those things we campaigned for and called at community. So our members was another set of reassurance for another few months about their jobs. But there's still a lot of workers that are currently missing out on those schemes, and the situation for them at work is totally different in their experience of this crisis. The recently employed who have missed out on the coronavirus job retention scheme, millions of workers again missing out. Over 2 million self-employed people have applied for the scheme. That's over 2 million people self-employed people not being covered by the scheme. Those recently self-employed, those who run as limited companies, and those who might have been on a payee job alongside self-employment and don't make 50% of their income. One of our members, along with many others, is in that situation. She's not entitled to anything, absolutely nothing. And she's, the past 3 months have been so difficult for her to continue putting food on the table. And those stories aren't uncommon. We hear it every single day, particularly from our self-employed members, but from members across our union and across the economy who are all in very, very different and difficult situations. But on the self-employed scheme, I thought it's worth mentioning that we've seen some positive action from the Scottish Government, and that's something I don't say often, but I am on this, that they have provided sort of payments for the newly self-employed, and we're calling for that to continue, and have written to the Scottish Government since. So we're looking at some initiatives that councils that the Scottish and Welsh Government can introduce to help plug those gaps, but we'll continue to keep lobbying the UK Government to plug those gaps on both the schemes, so that everyone can be supported no matter what the job and what their sector they work in. So aside from that direct income support, I think this crisis has shown and exacerbated existing inequalities in the world of work, particularly those working from home and those who can't. I think research shows that 1 in 10 of the entire bottom half of earners can work from home, and that experience is stark. And as I mentioned before, it's been a real mix for us. For example, less than 20% of our members are actually working from home at the moment, and under 30% have been furloughed or put on short-time working. For our self-employed members, we've got about 66% that are still working because you're allowed to on that scheme, but around 50% weren't eligible for the self-employed income support scheme. So it's a real diversity of experiences and situations that our members are facing, and employees across the country will, I'm sure, be in similar situations and positions. And for those, redundancy is still on the horizon. Their job security is still not absolutely guaranteed through the various schemes, and some have absolutely no income at all at the moment. So I think we've seen, in that respect, quite a terrible impact on work and the workforce. And some of those key consequences of that have been on people's mental health in particular. I think this crisis is not only risking sort of our physical health, and our physical health is at risk across the country, but also our mental health is under immense pressure at the moment. And we're seeing that every single day from a lot of our members and a lot of our workforce. When we asked our members whether the current situation had never negatively impacted their mental health, around over half of our members said yes. We hear from members who have not been furloughed, which is quite an interesting experience, and have still been working, for example, our steel workers and our justice sector workers and our logistics workers that Martin outlined at the start. And they feel like they're expected to take on a higher workload to compensate for those who have been furloughed. And they're having extra stress, extra pressure at an already really stressful time. And those stories, I think, are really, really important that we have to bear in mind and consider when we're thinking about the impact of the current situation on work. And for our self-employed members, it was a lot higher in terms of their mental health and how they've been impacted. One of our members said to me, we don't deserve to suffer, but we don't know how we'll survive. And I think we've still got sort of months and months to see what the real impact will be across the country. And I think the Scottish Government and Welsh Government and the UK Government can really look to examine the situation of this crisis, review the situation of our mental health, understand the real scale of what needs to be done for workers and people all across the country. I think it was about 4 in 5 adults were worried about the effect coronavirus was having on life, with more than half saying it has affected their well-being and caused stress and anxiety. I think it's going to be a real issue that you have to tackle. And on top of that, a lot of people are now worried about going back to work. We've got non-essential workplaces opening next week, and how people are feeling about that is quite uncertain. I think the guidance, it's different across the country. There's different deadlines and there's different dates. That date is for the UK, for England, and not the entire UK. And members all across the country are still coming to us with questions of what guidance means for them, what dates they have to abide by. And that uncertainty doesn't help a really, really difficult situation already. So for those in England, just to point out, and as sort of an FYI, you know, they've been going back to work. They've been told they're going back to work next week with no risk assessments. They haven't been consulted about what that looks like when they go back to work. Some members rely on public transport to get into work, and that's not been recognised or considered. So there's a lot to do about ensuring that people, when they do go back to work, no matter where they are in the country, that they feel safe. And you know that's what we're here for as a trade union, to make sure that you can feel safe and supported when you do go back. But aside from those negatives, there has been positive impacts in the situation on workers in the workplace, particularly trade unions. It's my key one. And, you know, are people actually asking and understanding their rights at work? We've had people and members who have never even heard of trade unions before, never been involved, wanting to find out how they can make their workplaces better, more positive, how they can make it safer for their employees and themselves. And, you know, we've seen an increase in our membership, just to give you two examples, in our self-employed members and in our third sector members, so those who work in the charity sector. And that's really, really encouraging for sectors that aren't usually unionised. So I think it's one positive that we can take from this situation. Secondly is on employment practices. So, you know, we've seen that working from home and flexible working is not entirely impossible, and it can be something that we can achieve. I think it often does result in happier and more productive workforces. The current situation is obviously really difficult to properly analyse that, but it shows that it is possible that things don't come to a halt, and that organisations and employment can continue. And you know, for workers with disabilities or who are shielding at the moment or are in difficult situations, it means you can still continue to do the job and have the autonomy to sort of manage symptoms of their health conditions. But you know, I think it's important to say that flexible working doesn't always mean working from home. Instead of sort of having a desk office in your office job. For our logistics workers, it means flexibility when choosing a shift rota, or for our prison officers, it means adapting sort of start and finish times. And so I think that flexible working can apply to shift as much to the jobs that often dominate the space in this debate. But it's one positive that we've taken from this crisis of how we can change and introduce better working practices across the economy. So I think going forwards, just to quickly touch on that and then tell you what we think should happen in the future. There's a couple of things that we're calling for, but I'll just highlight a few of our key ones. Following on from the flexible working and the home working, keep the good things. You know, this crisis has shown what we can achieve and how we can embrace new and different ways of working to make it work for workers. Income and financial support. We know there's going to be a need for ongoing wage support, or the purpose of these UK government schemes will be questioned. We can't see a situation of mass redundancies, which will cost the economy even more. We've provided suggestions about different schemes. There's some really interesting ones that I'd encourage you to look at from the Netherlands, which targets companies who are experiencing the largest drops in turnover. I think it's really, really good examples and good practices across Europe that we can look to. It's sort of companies declare their turnovers and accountants certifying their declarations, and then they sort of support short-time working rather than continuing with the furlough scheme. I think it's something we could look at in the UK in terms of going forward beyond October. And I do think we need a wage guarantee for workers. You know, those who still can't get to work and will be shielding, provisions will have to be made. Safety at work. You know, a lot of good employers are doing good things, but as I've mentioned, there are some difficult ones with risk assessments and properly consulting the workforce, and we'll be continuing to ensure that the employers we work with lift and live up to that best practice, and work with the government to ensure that they can also say what best practice looks like and give those examples. Finally, I think there's a few issues around track and trace, which we've at Community been calling for to sort of reflect and adapt this scheme. You know, employees shouldn't have to take a hit on their incomes if they have to self-isolate. And I think that's a really difficult decision people might have to make. You know, especially those without savings or disposable income. Statutory sick pay is often not enough. And you know, we need a plan from the government, working with all the Scottish governments and Welsh governments on how we rebuild our economy post this crisis. How do we protect existing jobs and how do we create good new ones? And you know, that future is really important, and I think it's three key things as well: investing in people, good quality jobs, and social partnership. There has to be a real prioritisation across all our governments to ensure that businesses and companies are able to focus on investing in people and investing in our workforce. The reskilling efforts required are going to be absolutely massive, and we have to see a prioritisation of that on good quality jobs. You know, well-paid work, valuing how we think about our workers and our economy is absolutely important. And social partnership is the one I'm probably most passionate about as a trade unionist. This crisis has shown what can be achieved when government, businesses and trade unions work together, whether it's the introduction of that furlough scheme and self-employed scheme to health and safety at work across the UK. The benefits of such an approach are really evident, and I hope that continues as Brett's practice in the way we approach challenges and work and our economy going forwards, which is a positive I will end on. Thanks, Martin.
That's great, thank you, Kate. I think one of the clear things coming out of what you've been saying there is just the sheer inequality that exists in the way that coronavirus has played out economically. Obviously, it's a disease that doesn't discriminate in terms of how it affects people at large, but in terms of the economic impacts, it's very much falling on quite a narrow group of people. Our next speaker, Annalisa Dodds, is Labour Shadow Chancellor. I think she's joining us from the platform at Reading train station. She's been Shadow Chancellor for a few months now, and was elected as MP for Oxford East just back in 2017, almost 3 years ago, after spending a few years in the European Parliament. Annalise, I thought one of the places we could start here is in April, you wrote a piece for the Fabian Review, and in it you said, and I'm just quoting it here, "The chance to create a fairer country was squandered following the financial crisis. We cannot allow it to be so again following the current crisis." Almost 2 months on from writing that piece, what do you think are the ideas that Labour has that are going to convince people that we've got the best ideas to take the country forward out of this crisis?
Well, thanks very much indeed for the invitation to be with everybody just now. Typically, a train is going past just as I start to speak. Anyway, I hope that's not too irritating. And, I very much agree with what the other speakers have said about this. I suppose, particularly from the point of view of the Labour Party, I think maybe we need to split out our response to the kind of immediate circumstances and what we can be doing right now to support people, and then think about some of those longer range questions that are so critical. Because I think, people are counting on Labour to be there for them. And this is a crisis when so many people feel like they have been left on their own, like they have been forgotten. I mean, we were told that, everyone really would be in this together. Well, we've heard that phrase before somewhere, haven't we? But actually, in many cases, I think a lot of people are feeling like they're having to deal with these issues on their own. And, I very much agree with what the other two speakers have said around that. I suppose just very quickly around some of those aspects. First of all, as you'd anticipate, we have been saying as a Labour Party that we need to deal with those big gaps in provision with the major programmes, particularly the furlough scheme and the self-employed scheme. But the reason why they're so catastrophic in the UK compared to in many other countries is because, of course, our system of unemployment insurance is so weak. Because if you bump down onto universal credit, then you're bumping right down to about 10% on average of people's incomes. So it really is an enormous problem if people end up in the social security system rather than being protected through one of these schemes. So we've had some success in some changes around the social security side, but it's still not reflecting people's cost of housing. It's not reflecting the fact that, if you have just a little bit of savings, then that immediately means you're counted out of a lot of the support that you might get. But also, of course, the social security or kind of social security-like system that's meant to protect people in these kinds of circumstances, again, isn't adequate. And that's a big problem when it comes to dealing with this disease. And, I very much agree with what was said about statutory sick pay, for example. Very, very low rates, far lower than in other countries. We could see a situation where if Test, Track and Isolate is running properly, and unfortunately I don't think it is at all currently, but as and when it is, that people could be asked to isolate repeated times. Actually, they could be asked to stay at home over and over again, and if they don't have that support there, then that's going to be a very big problem. It will also incidentally be a big problem for their employer, potentially, if they employ over the requisite number of employees to have that cost or some of it absorbed by government. So that's a problem that needs to be sorted out, because ultimately, this crisis will last for so much longer if we can't actually get test, track and isolate dealt with and deployed properly. Secondly, we've been trying to underline to government the critical importance of confidence here. And, you know, I really agree with what others have said here. You know, it's not just enough to say to people that they have to go back to work. You need to make sure that people will feel safe when they do so, but also that consumers are going to be willing to go back into those environments. And that means a far stronger grip on the kinds of consultation and tripartism that Kate was quite rightly putting forward there. You know, that we do have that ongoing process involving trade unions and businesses that's transparent, so that when there are issues about different industries, they can be quickly dealt with and we don't diminish that confidence. But then, of course, from the Labour point of view, we are looking to the future. I mean, one critically important aspect of that, very sadly, of course, will be around unemployment, where we're likely to see the rise up to about 10% probably. Now, we didn't have that after the last financial crisis, you know, partly because of what was mentioned at the beginning, the fact that we've had a very, very long squeeze on living standards. We've seen in practice a lot of businesses taking on more people, investing less in plant and less in kind of physical capacity and productivity improvements at kind of at a physical level. Now, that's meant that we didn't have that unemployment crisis to the same extent after the last financial crisis, but we will have it in this one, because there was a lot of those really labour intensive industries which have been put in such a difficult position by this virus. So what do we do about that? Well, we need to have a proper plan for unemployment. We're calling on the Chancellor to produce that. You know, there's been vague well, not grumblings, how to put it, vague rumblings about having some kind of an apprenticeship guarantee. Well, you know, it needs to go far, far further than that. We need to make sure that we're reskilling people, retraining people, learning from what's worked in different contexts, what local authorities are doing around a lot of this, which has been really successful, and what trade unions can put into that as well, and making sure they're really key players in this because they know the workforces that they represent. Secondly, it is about investment for the future. Myself and Ed Miliband launched a green consultation, a consultation on the green recovery. It'd be really great to get people's thoughts around that. I'm obviously talking to the Scottish Labour MSPs about how we can make sure that there's sufficient investment funding in Scotland as well, you know, that we have that appropriate support, because it'll be critically important for getting demand going. But then there's those really big questions about the labour market that I think both speakers alluded to that we need to deal with. We can't continue in a situation where so many people are in casualised work, where so many families are so lacking in financial resilience. You know, a quarter of UK families didn't even have £100 in the bank when this crisis hit. We've got to deal with that. That means having a new settlement, a much fairer one, with a more progressive approach to taxation and with quite substantial reforms to our labour market. So I hope that's a quick kind of canter through some of our thinking, but, you know, really looking forward to people's questions. And I would say, if we don't have time to cover the whole debate in this short call, please do always get in contact with me. I know Jackie's keen to hear from people as well, and I'm in touch with her a lot as well. So really, really good to be on the call with you all.
Thanks, Annalisa, and thanks for joining us. It's the first Zoom call I've been on that someone has joined us from a train station. So out of all the many Zoom calls so far, rather than just having a discussion between us to begin with, I'm just conscious of time and your time as well and everyone's time. So I'm going to open it up to questions straight away. So if anyone has a question, please just press the raise hand button and then we'll work our way through them. If you don't want to appear or you don't want to talk, just stick your question in the Q&A box. So we will go first to Catherine Sangster. Let's see if this works. And it'll take a second just to unmute Kath. Kath, you should be unmuted. On you go.
Hi, Martin. Thanks for that, and thanks to all the panelists. That was really interesting. My question is, obviously there's lots of kind of moving parts to how we restart the economy and rebuild, but something that is very pertinent is the fact that we still don't have a plan for how we're going to get schools back. And that obviously plays a large part in being able to get your workforce back. So I just wondered what people's thoughts were on that, in terms of flexible working and, you know, moving to maybe a 4-day week, etc.
Kate, should we start with you on that one? Just because there must be a lot of your members who are also at home looking after and homeschooling small children at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And childcare is a huge issue on how many of our members will actually get back to work, you know, and it's been a key part of our risk assessments with employers as to whether workers continue working from home and what the situation looks like for them at school, for their kids at school as well. You know, I think we've seen some stats, particularly for women, on getting back to work and how it will impact them, you know, the amount of women who are doing more unpaid work than paid work at the moment. So I think the situation for parents is really difficult, and you know, I'm luckily not in that situation, but many of our members who are coming to us looking for support on getting back to work do need that sort of really crucial help in what the next few months, what the summer holidays will look like. My sister's a teacher and she's got to go back to school next week. She teaches year 6. She's in England, and you know, she's still not really had that certainty that she'll be safe and the kids will be safe at school. There's been a U-turn now from the UK government on, you know, the other children going back to school. So I think, you know, we need certainty from both sides, certainty for workers and how they will get that proper childcare, how their jobs will be guaranteed and the incomes will continue to be guaranteed so they don't have to have additional stress than they already must be under. But also how we can make sure that kids and teachers are going back to school safely across the UK, and keep reassessing and evaluating that situation, I think, is going to be key.
Annalisa, obviously the Tories just dropped their plans to bring primary school kids back yesterday, and in Scotland we're not intended to bring back all schools until I think August, and even then it'll probably just be on a rota basis. So how do you think we get through this challenge?
I mean, I think we need to get through it with a very different approach to what we've had so far. I mean, certainly I would say in the English context, there's been a very, very divisive debate around this, where we've seen the teaching unions being pitted against parents. And that's been extremely damaging, because it's meant that when children are actually allowed to go back to school in the limited number of years that they have been able to go back to school in England, that huge numbers of parents are not actually sending their children back to school. We should have had an attempt to build consensus around this. That's what Keir Starmer called for. He actually called directly to the Prime Minister to work with him on that, and Boris Johnson refused to do it. So I think we need to have that kind of tripartite approach, consultative approach occurring everywhere. And I think this is also partly about resources, if I'm honest. I mean, we're potentially in a situation in England where we won't have any return in August either. We won't have anything, any provision across many, many schools. You look at what's happened in many private schools, actually the children have been schooled quite intensively in many cases during this period. So there's a big, big issue for equality there that we need to deal with. And just very quickly on the point around workers, in case people haven't heard, we've been pushing obviously very hard on this around the furlough scheme as well, where, you know, it looked like parents might not, who had those unmet caring needs, that they might not still be receiving furlough into the future at the same rate, just like with people who are shielding. We've made some progress on that today. So the Chancellor today said that parents would still be able to be furloughed and still receive that amount into the future. And the Prime Minister intimated that he would be keeping the support there for people who are shielding as well. The idea, however, that they hadn't thought from the beginning that this would be a problem, I find quite astonishing, but at least we're getting to a better place on it now.
Thanks, Annalisa. Mark, I don't think this one's one of your area of expertise, so unless you've got, you can wave if you've got something to add. There's something, on you go.
I just wanted to have one quick point again to pick up on that both Kate and Annalisa mentioned, in the inequalities of the impact. There's also the impact on the unequal impact on the children of the school shutdowns and the working from home, which is also going to have knock-on effects, and from an economic standpoint in future. But you know, the IFS has done a lot of great work charting the time use of families and how they've changed their time use over the course of the school shutdowns. And I find that, you know, families at the bottom of the income distribution, you know, the families that are more disadvantaged or have far less resources to dedicate to homeschooling their children. I just wanted to highlight that problem as well. There's two sides to it. I suppose it's important to get people back to work when we can, but also there's children that are losing out on valuable school time, and it's not been lost out equally.
I suppose also from the point of view of the Scottish economy, like I know you've done work before on, among other things, education and the impact of education and skills in the Scottish economy. So I would suspect that a whole generation of kids deferring university, not doing their exams, is also going to have an impact on how we might, specifically in the Scottish context, recover out of this crisis. Yeah,
exactly. We're talking about the sort of the recovery and the prospects of future generations and their contribution to that recovery. And if we have that generation missing out on school time, deferring university and education, then it's going to have definite knock-on effects on our ability to sort of move forward on the other end of the pandemic.
Brilliant, thanks, Mark. I'll take the second question from Paula Kane. Paul, you should be unmuted now.
Thanks, Martin. Hi, can you hear me?
If you could just introduce yourself as well at the start of the...
No problem. My name is Paula Kane. I am a Labour and Cooperative Councillor in East Renfrewshire. Thank you, Martin, and to the Fabians for this event. I think it's been really informative so far, and thank you to the panellists for some really thoughtful contributions. I suppose my question and my contribution would be around the crisis that local authorities are now facing. I think it's fair to say that councils have really been on the front line of COVID and trying to, I think, support communities, carers, care homes, delivery of shielding packages and free meals and all the things that we know have been required. Huge financial challenges now for local authorities. Reading today, for example, that Edinburgh City Council is about to furlough 500 of its workers. Councils who are really struggling now financially. And in the UK, as across the UK, I was talking to someone last night from a London borough where they expect the council to actually serve notice that they're going to run out of public funds. So a very stark situation. And I suppose we talked there about building better and rebuilding better. That was something that Mark had mentioned. And I suppose my kind of question is, how do we rebuild better in communities, where councils have already been starved of cash by the Scottish Government? And I think even just to get back on an even keel, there's going to have to be some pretty substantial investment and a pretty structural investment in communities that have been the hardest hit. So I think just keen to understand the panel's view about how can we rebuild better when we are really, really struggling.
Thanks, Paul. Annalisa, obviously the situation in Scotland is slightly different, but local authorities in both places have really taken the brunt of this. How do you think Labour can respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with what Paul said about the situation. Local authorities really have been at the front line. But what I've been trying to impress on the Chancellor and to government is that local authorities have got to be at the heart of the economic response to this into the future as well. Because, we've just been talking about how it's a crisis that's particularly concentrated in different areas, in different sectors. Local authorities understand their areas. They're deeply engaged in that kind of, for want of a less policy wonky phrase, place shaping activity already. They're the ones who know a lot of the time, working with business actors, with trade unions and others, what the skill gaps are. They know which businesses are in trouble currently. They're the ones who can identify very, very quickly people who are vulnerable. So I think in those circumstances, certainly what I've been doing is trying to say to government that local authorities are going to be part of the solution, a big part of it, but they can't do that if they're totally starved of resources. And I think what Paul said about the situation in relation to Scottish councils already was absolutely spot on. In relation to English councils, we've had a resiling by the UK government. Initially it said it would cover all the costs. Then it shifted to say, we might not cover any income that's been lost as a result of this. Now they're even suggesting that they won't cover the costs that have been incurred directly through spending. So they've gone right back on what they said before, and we're certainly going to be holding their feet to the fire on that.
Thanks, Annalisa. Mark, I know from the Fraser Allander economic commentary that you did in March, there was, I think, a third of employment in Scotland is actually in the public sector. It's government employment. So obviously what Paul was talking about there in terms of workers being shed from local authorities would have a major impact on the Scottish economy more broadly. But obviously we've not had compulsory redundancies in Scotland. But, you know, if there was a kind of employment impact in the public sector, what kind of impact would that have on the economy as a whole?
Yeah, the public sector, as you rightly say, makes up a sizable portion of employment. So, you know, if these if effects do filter through to the extent that we start seeing sort of, as you say, mandatory redundancies at a large scale, particularly in you know, in a lot of smaller communities that, you know, depend on government agencies that are located there, or local government or local government services, you know, it can only act to worsen the local economic effects, and then that's going to have, you know, spillover effects onto the sort of delivery of services, as Paul said in his question. There's the sort of the immediate concern of, or the concern of, you know, loss in employment and the spillover and the economic effects and how unequal it will be across the country. We've got a lot of you know, government staff here at Edinburgh, within Edinburgh at the sort of Scottish Government head office, but you know, there's a whole diversity of other sectors and industries within Edinburgh that would make it more resilient to cuts, say, in a sort of in the public sector. Other communities aren't so lucky to have a sort of diversity of sectors that they can help boost up their employment levels with, or their economy with. And also, just to touch on Paul's point about the sort of the building better at the community level, I think that sort of brings me back to that point I mentioned about, you know, restructuring and thinking about, you know, parts of our economic and policy model that have been inefficient, whether that is, you know, rethinking, you know, powers that local government gets, how money is allocated, something like, you know, the small business bonus scheme and the non-domestic rates relief policy that was sort of rolled out in the midst of the crisis has really highlighted, I suppose, the sort of the need for a little bit more flexibility on those fronts, and also the sort of lack of capacity sometimes local authorities and governments have to deal with these types of shocks at that level. So I think that's one sort of local inefficiency that was really brought up and can be thought about as we move forward, about how we can make that work better locally.
Great, thanks. And Kate, you've got a lot of members working either near to or in social care services, other areas. Like, you know, what have you been seeing in local authorities, and what do you think their role is in getting us out of the crisis?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks, Paul, for a really good and important question. And, you know, thanks to all the work you and councils across the UK are doing in really, really difficult and pressurising circumstances. We've been in communication with council leaders across the country, particularly initially around self-employment and sort of plugging the gaps in support, but also hearing about the really, really good and interesting initiatives councils are doing during this time. You know, with limited and pressured resources, councils have been amazing in providing direct support for our members. You know, they're the ones who have actually been getting money to small businesses in their pockets. You know, they're the ones that are helping our care workers with that extra support if they need it when they are on low incomes, and making sure that they have the PPE. And we've seen some brilliant examples of councils and local schools teaming up together to actually source further PPE for some of our members in social care. And that has been so powerful. And, you know, kudos council for doing so. And just to build on Annalise's and Mark's points, I think rebuilding councils are absolutely vital to that, and I think the government knows it, and the government will rely on councils, but, you know, without actual strong local industrial strategies with proper investment, I don't see how councils can be expected to actually deliver on it, to the extent and to the level that they want to. So I think they completely agree, and thanks to Labour for all the work they're doing in lobbying the government and the Chancellor to actually provide that proper support and that proper investment. And, you know, we've seen councils, when we have had crises before in local economies, particularly, you know, we can look to 2016 in Redcar, which is one of the steelworks that we represented at Community. When that shut down and when thousands of workers lost their jobs, it was local council and local authorities working together to reskill those workers, provide them with learning opportunities and get them back into work. And I think councils are really, really vital in providing those opportunities, reskilling and providing, you know, people in their boroughs and their communities with those opportunities and actually delivering it on a day-to-day basis. So I think it will be vital, and yes, they absolutely need that support to do so.
Thanks, Kate. The next question is from Katrina Monroe. We'll just bring Katrina in.
Hi, Martin.
Hi, Katrina. On you go.
I was thinking about the politics of this. Keir Starmer and you, Annalise, have started to make an impact on Boris Johnson's credibility in dealing with the crisis. But in Scotland, that's much harder. But politically, I think we have to start pointing out what the Scottish Government have done badly, and that Scottish independence would have made the already dire economic consequences even more difficult to withstand. And I just wanted to hear your comments on those thoughts.
Annalise, are you still there? Hopefully not been cut off.
I am still there. Sorry about that. I do apologise for this, by the way. I'd hoped that I would have been home by now to do this properly. But I mean, I think Katrina is right. And clearly, you know, there are very strong levels of support. Polling shows us this for the actions that the Scottish Executive have taken. But I think it is important that obviously as an opposition in Scotland that, you know, when there have been problems, and, you know, obviously I talk a lot to Ian Murray about this, and he's very concerned about a number of those problems, that we do make that clear and we try and fix those problems and get them dealt with as soon as possible. You know, that critical area of testing, I know, is one where, you know, the system hasn't been working to the extent that it should have been in England, and to be honest, it hasn't really been in Scotland either, and that's going to be so important for the future, that we have Test Track and Isolate up and running as strongly as it can be. And then I think also, you know, I'm thinking back to a lot of the themes that Scottish Labour have been working on for a very long time, you know, working on the fact of such regional inequality in Scotland, the fact that we have seen those local authorities not funded to the extent that they should have been, but also the need for industrial coordination in Scotland. And obviously that's something that we've been calling for in England as well. You know, I think we've seen that, and it's been so frustrating to me. You know, I know there are lots of amazing manufacturers right across the UK who were standing ready to produce that protective equipment, for example, to produce the ventilators and so forth. You know, it's often trade unions that went into the breach, you know, particularly around ventilators, to get that coordination going. Now, we shouldn't have been in that situation. We need to have that better coordination for the future. So I think there are issues that we need to be pushing on. And certainly I'm determined to be doing all I can to support Ian and Richard and Jackie in that task.
Thanks, Annalisa. Mark, just on, without, obviously you're from the Fraser Allander Institute and you won't want to get dragged into the politics of this, but I noticed in one of the articles that Fraser had produced, there was some data around the extent of the support for Scottish businesses and obviously individuals, and through things like the self-employment support scheme from the UK government. So could you say something about that, and also just the sort of, what I've taken from your comments, some of your comments tonight, is that the underlying strength of the Scottish economy is weaker than it probably should be. Like, you know, do you think that, how do you think that kind of UK support has played out in the first few months of this crisis?
So I think when the support was the numerous supports were first rolled out, you know, we were in the thick of the crisis, and everything was new, and at the time, we had written on the support measures and who they were covering, and how, you know, blanket they were going to be and how many people they were going to help. Also paying attention to, like Kate said, about who they left out and who wasn't covered by things like the self-employment scheme. And the word that was branded around as a sort of caveat, and a lot of that discussion was, you know, unprecedented. So we don't really know if this is what's needed and will it, you know, meet the targets. And I think as the crisis is worn on, there'll start to be, I hate to use the word inefficiency again, but it's started to think more about the sort of the inefficiencies of the coverage, and on two dimensions. One, people that it's left out, and people who haven't been covered by it, and then two, on the other side of the spectrum, people who perhaps are getting more support than they otherwise would have needed, or not otherwise would have needed, sorry, but then perhaps they do need when people are being left out completely. I don't want to make any statements about need or requirement, but just when you think about people who are perhaps missing out. So I think that's all to say that at the time, when they were rolled out, it was seen as a sort of great move forward, and the schemes were welcome, and Scotland has definitely benefited from it, and we will continue to benefit from it, even as non-essential sectors go back to work sooner in England than they do in Scotland. We'll continue to benefit from these schemes, and as Kate said, they've been extended on. So our sort of differential approach in Scotland to using those measures is catered for by that. But on the strength of the Scottish economy, yes, I think that was one of the things that we've been thinking a lot about at the Fraser the last few weeks, is based on what we know about growth and our recovery over the last decade, how resilient might we be to recover from this crisis. And it may be that economic demand bounces back a little bit, because this is a sort of deliberate shutdown, so there is some sort of pent-up demand that will come back when things get going. But given that the size of the crisis is so much larger in terms of economic activity and employment than the financial crisis, and how I made a point in the presentation, and I just want to say it again, that real wages increased every decade. It's like the 60s, and then the last decade, they're now 3%, still 3% lower than they were in 2008, and that goes into things like the productivity and the strength of the economy and growth. So I think that to sort of wrap that up, there are a lot of sort of uncertainties about, even with the support and the extensive support, if it's taken away and businesses collapse, are we going to be anywhere near resilient enough to sort of get back to anywhere near pre-crisis levels in the coming year?
Great, thanks. And Kate, from your point of view and community's point of view, how would you rate the performance of the Scottish Government through this?
I'm completely agree with what Annalise said, and particularly, Ian Murray is a brilliant MP and a proud community member, and his actions in holding the Scottish Government to account, I think, have been brilliant the past few weeks, and indeed beyond that, particularly with testing, I think it's a real issue. And actually ensuring that, I think PPE is still an issue for the Scottish Government to address. And, we've seen it with our members in Scotland, where they need more PPE than being given. And, it's these issues that the Scottish Government can address and can take responsibility for, and should be. And we'll continue to support Annalise, Ian and other Labour colleagues in holding the Scottish Government to account when we need to, and for our members as well. But, as I said in my earlier remarks, introductions such as the grants for newly self-employed, we do commend the Scottish Government for doing that, because it did help a lot of our members, but there is a lot more the Scottish Government needs to do. And in response to the question, particularly on independence, how much harder it would have been for trade unions in particular during this current crisis to respond effectively and respond well with additional barriers across the UK would have been even harder. And working with the Scottish Trade Unions Congress and the National Trade Unions Congress, we've been able to achieve more. And it's completely our position. When community campaigned against independence all those years ago, we still sort of proud of those values and value it to this day. And think that obviously we are so much stronger together, and that collectivism has been really, really important throughout this crisis for trade unions.
Great, thank you, Kate. We've got about sort of 5-10 minutes left, so we'll try and get through. There's a lot of people wanting to ask questions. We'll try and get through at least another couple. I'm really sorry if you don't manage to get your question answered. We will go to Jamie Stark. Jamie?
Yep, hello.
Hi, on you go.
So I was just wondering, because I know there's going to be like a lot of job losses after Corona, but there's a lot of businesses, even where I'm from in Edinburgh, that are like small businesses that rely especially on tourism, and especially during the fringe, there's a lot of, you know, food vans and stuff that are maybe owned by 1 or 2 people that, you know, rely on the fringe to give them the income to survive the rest of the year, and, you know, other kinds of festivals all over the UK. And I was wondering what ways the government or any of us could support those kind of businesses to stop them going under after this is all over.
Great. Thank you, Jamie. Mark, do you want to start with that one? There's obviously a lot of the Scottish economy that relies on tourism, food, drink, distribution.
Yeah, I would say there's sort of 2 main points to that question, and that, and again, it goes back to sort of what we talked about a little bit earlier, and the support will have to perhaps at some point become a little bit more concentrated and bespoke. And Kate also touched on this in our discussion of how to help businesses and help workers and target policy. So in the case of small local businesses who are in the food and accommodation, entertainment sector, and I'm just focusing on those because you mentioned Edinburgh and the fringe and things like that. You know, the government, in terms of economic policy, will have to think about, you know, first of all, what's the best advice and structure and framework to allow them to operate and make money and be clear about it. And then second of all, what support, you know, take the example of small business, the small business bonus scheme and non-domestic rates relief, how that can perhaps become more targeted to businesses that are most at risk. You know, if you have pubs that might have otherwise been at the fringe or operating during the fringe, now having to operate, you know, only tables for 2 with everyone 2 meters apart. There are not many venues in Edinburgh that have got that type of space. The second part of how we can support them economically as a community, I think, comes from the businesses, and that businesses will start to, I'm sure, innovate a little bit and think about how they can keep as much of their activity going as they can. And then it's sort of it's on the responsibility of them and us together as communities to sort of engage with them. You know, if local businesses continue to offer takeaway food as opposed to sit-in food, or coffees to take away instead of sitting in, things like that. These are all things that there's 2 sides to, and I think that if the support becomes more targeted and businesses open activity as they can, and our demand sort of creeps back up, that will definitely help to make sure that businesses stay viable.
Annalisa, if you're still, I would just on the back of Jamie's question, there's obviously a lot of businesses where the support that is going to end in October, there'll be theatres, restaurants, bars, you know, some places that might not be able to open at all because they just can't socially distance. Has the Labour Front Bench sort of thought about what we might be pushing for after some of these schemes that are run out for those areas of the economy that just can't work?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I really agree with what Mark said there. I think it's absolutely critical that we don't take a one-size-fits-all approach to this. And actually, if you look at what's happening with the furlough scheme and the self-employment scheme, there is a one-size-fits-all approach being taken because everyone is being treated the same, aside from, it looks like from today, you know, shielding people and people with caring responsibilities. But everybody else, no matter what sector they work in, is being expected, you know, in the case of the furlough scheme, to have an employer contribution coming in. Now, I've warned the Chancellor and said to him, if that goes ahead, then we will see waves of redundancies as each differential employer contribution comes in. I think there are ways to make these schemes more targeted, actually. I mean, obviously, Mark was talking about grant schemes. We've now got a kind of discretionary pot in England run by local authorities, kind of analogous to some of what's happened in Scotland. But I think if we look at the salary backfill schemes, you know, we could have versions of those that would be more targeted. You know, similar also to what Kate was saying about self-employed. Well, you could apply it to self-employed people, that Dutch scheme where you're actually looking at how much people have lost from this. But I would then say, secondly, kind of building on Mark's second point, you know, I really think this is a time where we need to be focusing on how we can really promote productivity. How can we support businesses to innovate? I think some of them will get there on their own, but you know, we've really had, I feel very strongly, quite a missed opportunity around a lot of this. You know, we've got a skills portal in England. We've got a kind of similar thing happening in Scotland, most of it focused on digital skills. Why can't we make it broader? Why can't we make it about many more aspects of business operation? Why can't we really have that reskilling going on and supported, you know, rooted into local further education and higher education as well? You know, I think that's one opportunity for us to be building that productivity for the future as well, which we already had problems with as a nation, even before this crisis started.
Thanks. And Kate?
Yeah, I would completely agree with all those points. And, you know, just to quickly supplement, I agree that, you know, the furlough scheme could have been made a lot easier, and there will be consequences to how sort of the terms and conditions. You know, the announcement sounded great, but actually we would have liked to see a bit more flexibility on that part-time working, where, you know, it doesn't have to be employees that you've just furloughed, and it can sort of be a lot more flexible in who you do bring back and who you can't bring back going forward. But unfortunately, that's the way it is at the moment, and we'll work with that. You know, after October, there will need to be some support schemes, as I mentioned earlier. You know, there's great examples across Europe that we should continue to look at for best practice of what can keep people in employment and keep their incomes coming in and putting food on the table at the end of the day, and avoid those massive redundancies that we might see. And particularly for businesses, you know, as Annalise mentioned about skills and digital skills and technology, I think it's a real opportunity at the moment. Particularly for SMEs, for them to realise the potential of doing that and increasing and boosting the productivity, and actually encouraging our businesses to use and adapt in different ways. And you know, the government should be encouraging businesses to do that and giving them the investment to do so, particularly with tech and digital skills. I think it's going to be absolutely vital going forward.
That's great, thanks. I'm going to take the last question just before we wrap up from Christina Boyd. Christina. To see if we can get Christina. Christina, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you.
There you go. Fire away.
I read recently that the mental health of women and children are particularly bad affected. They're the worst affected groups. If women don't get support for their mental health and for the mental health of children, they are not going to be able to return to work, and large numbers of women will fall out of the workforce. How can we ensure that women are supported so that they are able to maintain their position in the workforce and don't just fall through the cracks?
Kate, this is obviously something that community's been looking at quite a bit. Do you want to respond to that point?
There you go, can you hear me? Yep.
Yep.
I've not seen those stats, but it's absolutely not surprising that women and children will be more affected due to their mental health. You know, it's clear that it's going to affect everybody, and already is affecting everyone, and I think it's absolutely vital that that keeps being measured, so we can have a proper response to it. And you know, as I said earlier, mental health has been something at community that we're so passionate about campaigning on and ensuring our members are supported throughout. And I think economic and financial impacts have real consequences, and will have real consequences. And you know, whether it's a commission or whatever the government can do to properly analyse it, to examine that support, and the economic impacts that have had on women and also consequences of their children, is absolutely vital, because it's inevitable with some types of work and the demands that women and children have had to take up. So I would completely agree and echo your points, to be honest with you, and just say yes, a lot more needs to be done. You know, whether it's more targeted at women and children, I think it's something that the government should look into and that we would definitely support. And you know, realising the real serious and huge consequences this crisis, both on our health and on our finances, that they have. And you know, if it's women and children that are being more impacted, and I think that requires a more tailored and specific response.
Thanks, Kate. Annalise, I know that Jonathan Ashworth has written about the not so much on women specifically, but on the mental health impacts on poorer areas, and has said that that's something the Labour Party is looking at. You know, how do you think we respond to the mental health crisis from coronavirus?
I think it's a really, really critical question, and I'm very pleased that Christine has raised it, because I don't think it's had enough of a policy focus at all. I mean, actually, we're going to be seeing a lot of people who will be needing support into the future, both in terms of those women and children who will be experiencing those mental health problems. There's going to be there is a spike in addiction, it looks like, particularly to alcohol as well. We'll need to have those services there. And of course, many of the staff who might be dealing with that have also been called in to help to deal with the coronavirus crisis. So there's a big issue about potential burnout from some of the healthcare staff who might be helping with that. I mean, I think first of all, we've got to recognise this has been a time of a lot of what Angela Rayner's called silent pressures. I think it's absolutely right. People are dealing with this in their homes, which can often become, you know, a very, very difficult situation that they can't escape from right now. And I think one of the absolutely critical things that we need to do is we need to be focused on trying to give people as much certainty as possible and stop passing the responsibility just back onto their shoulders. We know that when people feel they're in an uncertain situation, that leads to higher levels of stress, and in extreme situations to mental health problems. You know, human beings can't cope with not knowing what we're meant to be doing into the future. And in many, many cases, you know, people don't know what they're meant to be doing necessarily to be safe. You know, guidelines are unclear. It's not clear what will be happening to financial support and so forth. I think those cases about the furlough scheme for those who are shielding, you know, just make the point. And the Prime Minister today said that issue had just been brought to his attention. Well, you know, surely this is something that needs to be factored in from the get-go, that people need that certainty. I think that's an immediate response that we need to make. That's great. Thanks, Annalisa. Before we wrap up, I'm just going to ask the panel one question before we finish tonight. And that question is we've obviously spoken about the recovery and building better. So that we can end this on a positive and optimistic note, and that's obviously sometimes quite difficult in these times. Just if we go through each of you one at a time, how do you think, and what action can government take coming out of this to build better and to make sure that we have a better economy on the other side of this than we did going into it? We'll start with Mark, and then Kate, and then Annalisa.
So I'm going to pick up on some points I think that Kate made earlier. And for me, the reliance on people in traditionally poor working conditions, low pay sectors, I think during this crisis is really made us think more about how we move forward and think about two things: the labour market and job security, and pay and conditions, and second of all, well-being, and how work can be tailored to sort of help with or promote well-being in workers, whether that's through flexible working patterns, a number of ways, hours, shift patterns, working from home versus the office. I think that's been thrust right into the forefront, and I think with the measures that will have to be in place for quite some time in the labour market and the workplace, it's really going to be a chance to shape how the labour market operates and works.
That's great. Thanks, Mark. Kate?
Yep, I would completely agree. I think people have to be at the heart of how we rebuild, and have to be at the heart of industrial strategy and plans going forward. And I don't think they have been. Throughout the past few years, you know, the government talks about levelling up, and now it's even more important than ever that happens, or at least we begin on that path. You know, we need to solve issues that create such a stark divide in the world of work that this crisis has exposed. You know, your health and your finances shouldn't be determined whether you can work from home or not. You know, whether you're a BME or whether you're on 0 hours or precarious work. And of course, if you're a key worker, your experience of work and the impact on your finances and your health shouldn't be determined by that. So I think absolutely invest in people, and focus and reevaluate the way we think about work and the way we approach work, and address those inequalities of the impact in the labour market, and, you know, consult with workers on the jobs recovery and how we can help them prepare for the challenges ahead.
Thanks, Kate. And finally, Annalisa?
Yeah, I mean, I strongly agree with what both Mark and Kate said, so I won't repeat it. I suppose I'd just finish off by saying, for me, the other thing that has been just incredible to see and very, very moving to see is how local communities, you know, often working with local authorities, with different groups, how they've really risen to that enormous challenge about helping people who need support and about helping the vulnerable. And I've found that to be incredibly important. We've got to keep that going. You know, it's going to be important for the environmental challenges into the future, but it's really, really important for that value of well-being as well. And I would just say, as a Fabian and a member of the Labour and Cooperative parties, I think that's really what solidarity looks like. So let's please keep that solidarity going into the future as well.
Great, thank you. That's a great optimistic note to end on. So I just want to finally just thank everyone who attended this evening, asked questions, and also, of course, Annalisa, Mark and Kate, our panellists. An appeal to join the Fabian Society. We're a membership organisation. We are, you know, funded by members, and we run events like this and publish original research. We're one of the few, I think, member-based think tanks that exist in the UK. So head to scottish.fabians.org.uk if you want to sign up. And you can also sign up there to get information about other upcoming events which will be running in this series. So thank you again, and I hope everyone has a good evening.